Way back, before Zimbabwe was even called Zimbabwe, it was a land rich in resources, a place many people called home. Then, colonialism happened. Think of it like someone coming to your house, deciding they like it a lot, and then telling you that most of it is theirs now. For many years, a small group of white settlers, who came during British colonial rule, ended up owning most of the best farmland. This wasn't just a little bit of land, we're talking vast, fertile areas perfect for growing crops. Meanwhile, the majority black population often found themselves pushed onto less productive land, or with no land at all. This created a deep sense of unfairness that bubbled under the surface for decades, a historical wound that just wouldn't heal on its own, an imbalance waiting for a reckoning. So, fast forward to the year 2000. The Zimbabwean government decided it was time to address this land issue head-on. They called it land reform. The main idea was to take some of the land from the few thousand white commercial farmers and give it back to hundreds of thousands of black Zimbabwean families. Imagine the government saying, okay, this land was historically taken, and now we're trying to make things right by redistributing it. It was a hugely significant move, deeply rooted in the country's struggle for independence and equality. The aim was to empower the local population, give them a chance to farm their own land, and build a more equitable society. It was a bold step, one that was always going to cause a stir on the international stage. Now, how did the rest of the world, especially powerful Western countries, react to this? Well, not everyone was thrilled, to put it mildly. The United States, along with the United Kingdom, the European Union, Canada, and Australia, saw this land redistribution differently. They raised concerns about how the land reform was carried out, citing issues like property rights and the rule of law. They argued that the process was often chaotic and sometimes violent, and that the former landowners weren't properly compensated for their property. It wasn't just a quiet disapproval, they decided to take action, strong action that would have long-lasting consequences for the entire nation of Zimbabwe. This action came in the form of sanctions. In 2001, the US passed a law called the Zimbabwe Democracy and Economic Recovery Act, or ZIDERA for short. Think of ZIDERA as a financial roadblock. It basically told big international banks and financial institutions like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, hey, don't lend any money to Zimbabwe or give them new financial help until they sort out these issues. The primary condition for lifting these restrictions included the restoration of the rule of law, which specifically mentioned respect for ownership and title of property and ensuring compensation or resettlement for the dispossessed white farmers. The US even declared a national emergency concerning Zimbabwe in 2003, expanding these sanctions further in 2005 and 2008, making it even harder for Zimbabwe to do business with the world. So, what happens when a country suddenly finds it much harder to get loans, to trade, or to attract investment? Well, Zimbabwe found out the hard way. These sanctions, led by the US, weren't just a slap on the wrist, they were a body blow to the economy. One of the first big hits was to Zimbabwe's export markets. The country used to sell a lot of its farm produce like flowers and vegetables to Europe and the UK. This was called the horticulture industry, and it was a big deal, contributing a healthy 4.5% to the country's total earnings before the sanctions. But with the new restrictions and the negative international perception, that market access shrank dramatically. Within 2 decades, that 4.5% contribution plummeted to just 0.8%. A massive drop that affected countless livelihoods. The pain didn't stop with farming exports, it spread throughout the entire economy, leading to something called deindustrialization. This is a fancy word for factories closing down and industries shrinking. Cities like Bulawayo, once a bustling industrial hub, saw many of its factories grind to a halt. Think about it. If companies can't get foreign currency to buy new machinery or spare parts because banks are wary of dealing with Zimbabwe, or if their international partners pull out, they can't operate. This had a direct impact on jobs. Between 2005 and 2020, it's estimated that over 610,000 jobs were lost because public companies in key sectors like agriculture, mining, and manufacturing were sanctioned or affected by the sanctions environment. That's a lot of people suddenly out of work, struggling to feed their families. And what about those new farmers, the very people the land reform was meant to help? Well, the sanctions made their lives incredibly difficult too. Smallholder farmers who now had land found it tough to get the money, credit, they needed to buy seeds, fertilizers, or modern farming equipment. Imagine getting a new garden plot, but having no money for tools or good soil. Input costs for farming soared because the local plants that produced these things deteriorated. They couldn't get funds for maintenance or upgrades due to the financial restrictions. So, even with land, boosting agricultural production became a huge challenge. It was like being given a car, but no money for gas or repairs, making the journey to prosperity a very bumpy one. The human cost of all this was immense. It wasn't just about numbers and economic charts, it was about real people struggling every day. United Nations special rapporteurs, who are independent experts, looked into the situation. Alina Duhan, who focuses on the impact of unilateral coercive measures, that's a formal term for sanctions imposed by one country or a group of countries without UN Security Council approval. And Hilal Elver, who reported on the right to food, both concluded that these sanctions were indeed harming ordinary Zimbabweans. They specifically pointed out that the sanctions were making it harder for people to get enough food, directly affecting their basic human rights. It's a heavy burden for everyday citizens to carry. Now, if you ask the United States government why these sanctions are in place, they'll give you a very specific answer. According to the U.S. Embassy in Zimbabwe, these sanctions are not aimed at the Zimbabwean people or the entire economy. They say the sanctions are targeted. This means they are supposedly focused on specific individuals and companies, a select list of people and entities that the U.S. accuses of things like corruption, human rights abuses, and undermining democracy. The U.S. position, as stated by Ambassador Pamela M. Tremont in late 2024, is that Zimbabwe's economic problems are mainly due to its own internal issues, bad policies, corruption, hyperinflation, and high unemployment, rather than the sanctions being the primary cause or a response to the land reform program itself. But if you talk to the Zimbabwean government and many people within the country, you'll hear a very different story. They argue that these sanctions, regardless of being called targeted, have a broad, devastating impact on the entire nation. They see the sanctions as a direct punishment for the land reform program, an attempt by Western powers to protect the interests of the former colonial landowners. Zimbabwe's officials contend that you can't just isolate certain individuals or companies financially without it affecting the whole economic system, like trying to remove just one brick from a Jenga tower without making the whole thing wobbly. They believe the sanctions are the main reason the economy has struggled so much for so long, hindering development and causing widespread hardship. It's not just Zimbabwe saying this. Many other African countries and regional groups have also spoken out. The Southern African Development Community, or SADC, which is a group of 16 countries in the region, has consistently condemned the sanctions. They've called them illegal and a violation of human rights, and have been demanding their immediate and unconditional removal for years. SADC even designated October 25th as Anti-Sanctions Day back in 2019, a day when member states collectively voiced their opposition and solidarity with Zimbabwe. This shows a strong regional consensus that these measures are unjust and harmful, and that it's time for them to go, so the country can breathe. The calls haven't just come from Africa. Even officials at the United Nations have weighed in, echoing concerns about the humanitarian impact of the sanctions. As mentioned earlier, UN special rapporteurs have highlighted how these measures negatively affect ordinary Zimbabweans, particularly their access to essential things like food and healthcare. They argue that while the stated aims might be about democracy or human rights, the reality on the ground is that the sanctions are making life harder for the very people they are supposedly meant to help. This international pressure adds another layer to the ongoing debate, questioning the effectiveness and fairness of such long-standing restrictive measures imposed by one set of nations upon another. In the midst of this ongoing sanctions saga, Zimbabwe has taken some steps to address one of the key international criticisms: the issue of compensation for former white farmers. In 2020, the government passed legislation that allows these former commercial farmers to apply to get their land back, or more commonly, to receive monetary compensation for improvements they had made. Reports indicate that hundreds of thousands of dollars have indeed been paid out for approved applications. This is seen as an attempt by Zimbabwe to meet international expectations and perhaps pave the way for a thawing of relations and the eventual lifting of sanctions. On the US side, there have been some recent shifts, though the core pressure remains. In March 2024, President Joe Biden made a significant move by terminating the national emergency concerning Zimbabwe that had been in place since 2003. However, this wasn't a complete lifting of pressure. Almost immediately, new sanctions were imposed under the Global Magnitsky Act, targeting specific entities and individuals, including President Emerson Mnangagwa himself. Crucially, the Zimbabwe Democracy and Economic Recovery Act (ZEDERA) remains in force, continuing to block Zimbabwe's access to crucial international credit and investment. Interestingly, other countries have also been reassessing their own sanctions. Just recently, in May 2025, the United Kingdom removed 4 former Zimbabwean security chiefs from its sanctions list. The UK didn't provide very specific reasons for these delistings, but it shows that the international consensus isn't static. While this doesn't directly affect US sanctions like ZEDERA, it's a notable development in the broader landscape of international pressure. So, where does this leave Zimbabwe today in mid-2025? The debate over sanctions is far from over. While some individuals have been removed from certain lists, the big one, ZEDERA, is still there, like a heavy anchor on the economy. The Zimbabwean government and its SADC allies continue to push hard for all sanctions to be lifted. Meanwhile, smallholder farmers, showing incredible resilience, continue to adapt, with many using sustainable agroecological farming practices to improve their yields. The future for Zimbabwe remains a complex path, navigating economic recovery and the long shadow of these enduring sanctions.